Hello, welcome. My name is Whitney Lee. I'm a developer advocate, and I'm here with Alex. Will you introduce yourself, Alex, please?
Hi, I'm Alexander Schwartz, or just Alex. I'm a Keycloak maintainer. I'm all day working on the Keycloak open source project, which is cool. I joined about 2 years ago, this Keycloak project, and before that I was working as a consultant, also working with Keycloak a lot, so it feels like coming home.
So Alexander and I, we just had a 2-hour-long conversation. He taught me everything there is to know about Keycloak, at least everything I could fit on this board about Keycloak. What we're making for you is a smaller recap for those of you who have less time to spend on the matter. So let's go over all the highlights of Keycloak, shall we? What was the world like before Keycloak existed that caused it to need to get created?
So about 10 years ago, that was a time when I think SAML was popular. OpenID Connect was just being created at that time. And I think there were more applications, both in the internet, both in the enterprise, and all they needed their own username and password. And you need to do user management there. And that was very, very tedious. That was then the point where OAuth, OpenID Connect became more popular as internet standards, published by, or I think first used by the big internet companies, but then also picked up by lots of applications, and was the day, or these days, where Keycloak was born, right?
Yeah, I definitely remember those days of the internet where every single website I had to remember what my username was for that one. Everyone had different rules about what it had to be, like, oh, does it have the exclamation point at the end, or how many capital or lowercase letters? So I am thrilled that this is solved, and that's not my experience as a user anymore.
But at that time, it was also like these buttons showing up, like login with Google, login with GitHub, all that. And this was then what OpenID Connect was then all about. But then you're not GitHub, you're not Google, right? And if you want to use something like in an enterprise or in your own environment with your own user database and use a similar experience, this is then where this single sign-on comes in from Keycloak, which leads us to identity and access management, because that's a lot more than just single sign-on, right?
Yeah, I guess I just had I am kind of together with that's just the same as authentication and authorization. But you taught me that it's so much more than that. It encompasses registering in the first place, how an authentication process, what that looks and feels like for a user. What if a user loses their password? That's something that's taken care of. But then as an administrator also, IAM solution is going to be about how you do multi-factor, whether you do multi-factor authentication and how you do it, what kind of roles you have in your system. You can manage both your users and your clients. And then also you can control what a login flow looks like. And then the one thing I didn't say is kind of saving for last is the authorization part. So a lot of this has to do with authentication, like the first time you're accessing a system. And then also authorization can be part of an IAM solution too. And that's what you're accessing once you're in there. How does Keycloak fit in with all of this?
Well, Keycloak brings all this identity and access management functionality to the table. So you either download the archive, unzip it, you spin up a container or put it into your Kubernetes. That's this binary. That's the 3 things down there, right? And you spin it up, you connect it to a database. Actually, you have a choice of databases, be it like a MySQL database, Postgres, MS SQL, Oracle, you name it. And then you have your own personal IAM running in your own site. And you can do it. You have all your data local. You can have your own rules. You have your own settings there. And you're free to match it your business purposes, your organizational needs, and I think that's really great. We have the login flow, so that's the thing we have here. Is only a small excerpt here, but then by default we will ask you for a username and password at each user when they log in. But then you want to configure: do you want to allow Kerberos login? So Kerberos being login, especially in enterprise environments without a password, because you're already logged into your Windows machine, maybe. You also say, do I want to have some follow-up actions after the user authenticated, for example? Do I want to confirm that the email is working after they logged in? I have a note saying, okay, you need to confirm your email address. So yes, I send an email link out, the user clicks on the link and then continues the login flow. All this is part of the login flow, and you can really configure it to your needs. Some people are actually confirm the terms and conditions in there because the applications don't want to take care of it. You can write your own plugins to put in there. To do the things that you need, and you can write plugins for this, but you can also write plugins for other places for Keycloak. So it's quite extendable and developer friendly, I'd say. There's a community tab on our homepage, and then you can see the plugins that other people have already developed and installed them.
I love when community comes together. So that kind of touches on a user experience, but also the administrator experience. With Keycloak, the administrator has a UI they can work with, correct?
Yeah, they have a UI where you configure maybe realms to the different environments from each other. You then configure how users log in, if they're allowed to self-register or not, all these some parameters for the login flow. You register new clients in there. But then you use the web UI to get familiar with Keycloak and what the capabilities are. But then if you're an administrator who wants to automate everything, you would soon drop to the command line or the REST APIs that we have, where you can automate all these, also script it. You can export it from in one environment and import it in another environment. So this is how the administrator experience is that you would have. So starting in the UI, dropping to the command line and APIs and automate everything.
And we talked about using realms to separate concerns for different projects. But also, if you don't want to use realms to do that, it's also common to do like whole separate Keycloak instances to help you separate concerns.
Yeah, and it's open source software. We don't license you by realm or by installation, which is cool. So if you have each staging environment, each test environment, you have a new set of Keycloak cluster instances or just a single node for testing. It's just fine.
Awesome. And then we went into an OpenID Connect flow. So we talked quite a bit about how a request bounces around between the user, the application that supports OpenID Connect and Keycloak. But the big takeaway from this section is that if an application supports OIDC, it's very easy to integrate it with Keycloak. The words you used when you described it to me, you said, it just works. I love those words. So even though we're talking about it like with some complexity here, it's really the user experience, the developer experience as someone integrating this login into the application with Keycloak.
It just works. When you do it for the first time, as I said, you might Google a YouTube video somewhere to walk you through the different steps. But in the end, it's going to be like 2, 3, 5 attributes, depending on your application framework you're using, where you put in the details to develop your own application or the similar number of entries for a third-party application that supports OIDC. And then they connect to Keycloak. Like, hopefully you will have a button, you put in all the details, press the test button, and then the application says, yes, it works. I talked to Keycloak and Keycloak is fine. Depends on the application you're trying to connect.
It depends. So we have a user who wants to access an application, an OIDC application. When that happens, the application is going to redirect the request to Keycloak. And that'll trigger Keycloak to start the login flow, which, as we said, could be anything or nothing, depending. Once Keycloak finishes that login flow, the user is authenticated. And so Keycloak will take the request and redirect it to the application via the user's browser. And this time it has an access code that's associated with it. So the app will then call the Keycloak and exchange this access code and receive 3 things. Receive an access token, an identity token, and a refresh token. After those tokens are received, the user has access to the application. But I would like to hear more about what are these 3 tokens.
The identity token, this is something where the application then knows about who the user is. Maybe the application wants to show a username, or it might need the email address to send an email to the user. All this information can be contained into an identity token. You can really configure that in a way you need in an organization when you use Keycloak. So per application, you can really be very specific what the application needs there. These access tokens, they are used to grant access to the user, to give him or her permission to do one or the other things. For example, to transfer money in the bank, to maybe look at account details, maybe to order a book, that kind of things. And this access token is usually short-lived. I'd say maybe 30 seconds, maybe a couple of minutes. And then this token expires, and you then use your refresh token to get a new access token. Once you do that, you talk to Keycloak, get this new access token, and once it's been returned, you know that the user is still logged in and that they didn't log out. So it's probably fine to, for example, transfer the money, show the account details, or order the book. Looking at the standard, it's opaque. So whenever you want to figure out if a user is allowed to do something, you need to send it usually to the identity or the single sign-on service that created that token. With Keycloak, It's a JSON Web Token. So if your application framework supported, you could parse this JSON Web Token there directly and figure out what the user is allowed to do or not allowed to do. You could also use it as a bureau token to backend services, so that's really cool. Yeah. And you can forward this access token also to other services like Keycloak to do fine-grained authorizations. Or we talked about also OPA, that your open policy agent that you can use to decode that token and do some fancy evaluation, moon phase, time of day to figure out if the user is allowed to do something.
The last thing we talked about is Keycloak benchmark project.
Yeah, so that's a sub-project. So a sub-project where we can collect tools, or best practices, how to deploy Keycloak to a cloud environment. So there are AWS scripts, there are Kubernetes scripts, Helm charts, Grafana dashboards. So everything you need to first install Keycloak, then generate lots of data for your load testing, because you don't want to test with a single user, not with 10 users, but maybe with 100,000 users. So that's why you generate lots of data for your load test. Then you have a load driver, where we have lots of concurrent logins, other activities, clients doing things, users doing their thing. And then once you put your system under stress, you want to figure out how well did the system do. That's something you may have as a response to your load drivers, but you also want to look into the system to see where maybe the bottlenecks are, where it failed, maybe find root causes, do some tracing analysis. So this is where we have all these metrics that help you to make sense why Keycloak behaved this way or another under load. And that's all part of the Keycloak benchmark project.
If you have any more questions about Keycloak and you want to contact Alex, you can go into the CNCF Slack. Also, probably before you contact Alexander directly, there's a Keycloak channel and a Keycloak-dev channel where you can put your question to.
And there's definitely the Keycloak homepage, including the blog. We might have some latest blog posts on the Keycloak benchmark project there if you want to get some more details.
And that's it. Keycloak is the open source identity and access management solution. So thank you so much for watching today. And thank you, Alexander, for sharing your time and expertise with us.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye-bye.